In the silence between battles and treaties, shadows lingered where no official record dares to tread. Beneath the rubble of fallen empires, there are stories sealed in tunnels, whispers inked in vanished files, and wounds hidden in forgotten jungles. What was buried was never meant to surface, yet fragments bleed through, unwanted, unexplainable, undeniable. These are not tales of victory or defeat, but of secrets entombed in the margins of history, waiting for the brave, or the desperate, to unearth them. In the winter of 1945, as the Reich crumbled from all sides, intelligence intercepts pointed to unusual traffic in the Harz and Thuringian regions of central Germany. British ultra-decrypts referred cryptically to Eisenfaust, a codename that carried no prior reference in Allied archives. The term appeared in conjunction with railway logistics, encrypted in high-level Wehrmacht ciphers, usually reserved for fuel and ammunition transfers. What was notable was the sheer volume. Entire train formations requisitioned, moving under blackout, bound not for the front, but for tunnels deep in the Thuringia Wald. American engineers of the 3rd Army's 90th Infantry Division, advancing on Gotha in April 1945, recorded in their after-action notes the discovery of rail junctions torn apart with dynamite, tunnels sealed with freshly poured concrete, and the smell of cordite lingering in the cold spring air. A lieutenant, named Robert Keller, attached as a technical officer, wrote in his personal field notebook, later archived at Carlisle Barracks, multiple wagons observed entering Heiligenstadt Spur on 8th April, none exiting. Local civilians mentioned constant train traffic during March. By 11 April, tracks destroyed, access buried. His words were terse, but suggestive of movements not reflected in German supply records. Soviet archival material, declassified in 1992 from the Ministry of Defense, sheds further light. Reports from the 89th Guards Rifle Division describe the capture of a Wehrmacht railway dispatcher near Nordhausen. Under interrogation, the man, identified as Oberfeldwebel Heinz Drexler, confessed that orders were to evacuate cargo of the utmost national priority from facilities near Mittelbau Dora. Dora, infamous as the underground factory where V-2 rockets were assembled by forced labor, was no stranger to secrecy. Yet Drexler claimed these trains carried items not for battlefield use, but for concealment. Engines that made no smoke, fuel that burned without flame, he is quoted as saying. Soviet officers dismissed his words as delirium. By late April, Allied aerial reconnaissance showed anomalies. Photographs of the forest near Oberhof revealed deliberate camouflage nets, stretched over railheads. In May 1945, once US forces secured the Harz region, teams from the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS, began systematic searches. Several tunnels were entered, but many were found collapsed or intentionally flooded. Photographic evidence preserved in CIOS report XX-4 depicts boxcars fused to their tracks by heat, interiors warped. Notes appended by Captain Harold Bixby, US Army Corps of Engineers, mention residual radiation levels detected by portable counters borrowed from Manhattan Project teams temporarily attached to Alsos. The notations, however, were later redacted in the publicly released version of the report. Civilian testimony adds an unsettling dimension. Farmers from villages near Ilmenau recalled hearing muffled detonations underground weeks after the war ended. One farmer, Karl-Heinz Lobenstein, interviewed in 1952 by a West German parliamentary commission, described seeing American soldiers enter a sealed tunnel with cutting equipment, only to return pale and vomiting, refusing to speak. His testimony was archived but omitted from the commission's final report. A US Army memorandum marked confidential, dated 14th August 1947, references the Eisenfaust anomalies and notes the loss of 4 engineers during post-hostilities, inspection of collapsed railway infrastructure. The cause of death is listed as respiratory seizure due to unknown environmental hazard. What precisely was moved in those final months? Some researchers argue It was the evacuation of advanced jet engines and rocket prototypes. Others suggest nuclear material, noting the Reich's uranium enrichment efforts at Haigerloch and Stadthilm. Still others point to psychological warfare, planting rumors of superweapons to unsettle the Allies. Yet the consistency of records, pointing to multiple missing train formations, sealed tunnels, and erased documentation, raises questions not easily dismissed. Post-war intelligence circles kept the matter alive. A 1951 CIA internal review, uncovered through a FOIA request, includes a section on German underground rail operations, Thuringia, 1945. The review states, at least 4 confirmed train movements departed Nordhausen sector between 3 September 8 April 1945. Final destinations unknown. Physical inspection of probable endpoints blocked by engineered detonations. Material likely destroyed, though uncertainty remains. Soviet forces remain equally preoccupied with locating said cargo. Marginalia on the document, in a different hand, read simply, "Do not pursue further." The Soviets, however, did pursue. Reports from East German Stasi files, compiled between 1961 and 1973, mention recurring sinkholes in the Thuringia Wald, some exposing twisted steel rails far below the surface. Geologists ordered to investigate were instructed to classify their findings as natural subsidence. In one case, near Suhl in 1968, workers clearing a landslide uncovered a section of rusted freight car, inside which were metal containers of unusual construction. The Stasi sealed the site, and the containers were reportedly transferred to Soviet custody. No further mention appears in the record. Today, NATO archival indexes list Eisenfaust under lost material, a bureaucratic phrase that conceals more than it reveals. The Eisenfaust files are sparse, fragments of rail schedules, blurred aerial photos, cryptic memoranda. What lingers are the anomalies: trains without cargo manifests, tunnels collapsed by professional hands, testimony of engines that burned without fire. Whether these were the final death throes of a regime attempting to conceal evidence of its crimes, or the burial of technologies too volatile for post-war handling, remains unresolved. 70 years on, the forests of Thuringia remain quiet. The tunnels, where they still exist, are overgrown, their entrances sealed by rockfall or bureaucratic silence. Local hikers still tell of strange metallic tastes in the air near old railway cuts, and some avoid them entirely. Official records insist there is nothing left beneath the hills but rubble. Yet in classified annexes of Allied and Soviet intelligence, Eisenfaust persists like a shadow, unfinished, unexplained, unburied. In the spring of 1957, scattered reports began surfacing in CIA cables about the survival and flight of certain former Gestapo officials. The Vatican ratlines, an escape network already notorious for funneling fugitives to South America, were said to be active once more, though this time the routes did not end in Argentina or Chile. Instead, they converged on the Adriatic port city of Trieste, then a tense border zone contested between Italy and Yugoslavia. It was here that Projekt Harpoon was conceived, a covert operation whose existence would be hidden for decades beneath redacted case files and missing field reports. At first glance, the mission appeared routine: locate and intercept a courier moving on behalf of former SS intelligence cadres. The CIA's Special Operations Division assigned 3 operatives, codenamed Gull, Harbour, and Mason, to shadow the courier and retrieve whatever materials he carried. Italian carabinieri were quietly advised to provide logistical cover without officially acknowledging the Americans' presence. A cable dated 19th May 1957, marked Eyes Only, describes the target as a middle-aged man, possibly Austrian, operating under false Vatican-issued documents. His movements suggested he carried more than correspondence. The cable warns, "Priority is not the man, priority is the cargo." Weeks later, surviving fragments of internal memoranda make it clear the cargo referred to microfilm reels, testimony extracted from a captured courier earlier that year in Munich. had mentioned designs for electronic countermeasures capable of blindfolding radar networks. Such technology, if genuine, would leapfrog existing Western systems by a decade. The Munich Courier claimed the designs had been smuggled out of a Luftwaffe signals facility in Prague in 1945, preserved by remnants of the SS Wissenschaft branch, and were now being offered to Soviet buyers in the Balkans. Washington authorized Harpoon on the condition that deniability remained absolute. From here, the record darkens. The surviving field reports from the three-man Harpoon team cease abruptly on 28 May 1957. Their last confirmed transmission, intercepted via the US listening post at San Vito dei Normanni in southern Italy, was a short burst of Morse. Package confirmed, intercept imminent. Hours later, Trieste police logged an anonymous call about foreigners seen boarding a small fishing vessel at night. The vessel was never identified in port records, nor was any wreckage later discovered. Inquiries by local authorities were brushed aside by the Italian Ministry of the Interior, citing jurisdictional sensitivity. The CIA's official explanation came months later. The operatives had likely drowned in an accident at sea. Yet British liaison officers attached to MI6's Trieste desk were unconvinced. Their own surveillance photographs, preserved in a file marked T57-194 black, show two unidentified figures transferring cargo from a sedan into canvas sacks near Molo Audace Pier. The photos were time-stamped within hours of the last Harpoon transmission. What those sacks contained remains unverified, but the context suggests they were not ordinary supplies. In 1963, a defector from Yugoslavia's UDBA secret police told West German intelligence that Soviet officers had taken delivery of unusual electronic components in Split, smuggled by sea from Trieste in June 1957. No corroborating evidence was provided, yet the detail matched too closely the vanished timeline of Harpoon to be coincidence. The allegation resurfaced during congressional hearings in Washington in 1976, though heavily censored. Only one unclassified note remains. Questions persist regarding loss of Trieste team, possible transfer of priority material to adversarial state. What makes the Harpoon file more unsettling is its absence in subsequent debriefing indexes. Normally, the CIA retained at least skeletal records of lost operations. Harpoon, however, is almost erased. Pages have been excised with razors. In one surviving document, the names of the operatives are not only blacked out, but overwritten with false identifiers. When FOIA requests sought the file in the 1990s, the agency responded with the phrase, "No such operation known to this office." Yet cross-references in declassified Navy communications clearly mention support provided to Harpoon team, Trieste sector. The human element remains haunting. Relatives of the missing operatives received only the vaguest of notifications, that their sons and husbands had been lost during duty overseas. No burial sites were provided. Internal State Department memoranda revealed debates about whether to erect a cenotaph, but the idea was abandoned for fear of drawing attention to a classified mission. As a result, the names of Gull, Harbour, and Mason, whatever their real identities, were never placed on official honour rolls. Researchers who have studied the case point to one final clue. In 1978, Italian divers exploring the wreck of a fishing trawler off the coast near Grado discovered metallic canisters embedded in silt, marked with stenciled numbers in a style common to wartime Luftwaffe inventories. The divers reported their find to local authorities, but the canisters were removed by unidentified officials before they could be fully catalogued. Newspaper accounts at the time dismissed them as fuel drums. No official retrieval report exists. Was Project Harpoon a failed interception, a betrayal, or a deliberate burial of technology too dangerous to reveal? Each hypothesis carries its own shadows. If the microfilm was genuine and reached Soviet hands, it might explain sudden advances in radar countermeasures observed in the late 1950s. If it was fraudulent, then the disappearance of 3 American operatives remains even harder to rationalize. What is certain is that Trieste, a city already steeped in Cold War intrigue, swallowed the mission whole. Today, scholars and investigators comb the fragments, photographs without captions, cables without signatures, maps with sections burned away. They reconstruct the last days of Harpoon not as a linear narrative, but as a mosaic of contradictions. Somewhere between the Vatican rat lines, the Adriatic docks, and a vanished courier lies the truth of what was carried and why 3 men were erased to keep it hidden. The official silence persists, as if the Adriatic itself had claimed not only their bodies, but the memory of what they pursued. When the Red Army stormed East Prussia in April 1945, the ruins of Königsberg smoldered with evidence of a regime in retreat. Yet amid the wreckage, Soviet intelligence units stumbled on something unusual. A partially burned ledger, its surviving pages headed with the phrase Projekt Morgenrot, Projekt Red Dawn. The file, recovered from the basement of a requisitioned municipal hospital, was catalogued under Medical Experiments Category Z by SMERSH field officers before being locked away in sealed archives. For decades, its existence was denied. Only with fragmentary declassifications in the 1990s did its shadow re-emerge. The surviving entries in the ledger were chillingly clinical. They listed patient numbers rather than names, along with annotations such as vitality after 12 hours sustained and immediate reuse of subject. Locations were abbreviated: Stalag, 327, Lazarett Nord, Sonderbunker 9, suggesting a network of facilities. The implication was clear. Morgenrot had not been a conventional medical project, but something far darker, focused on field-compatible resuscitation techniques. In plain terms, a grotesque attempt to reanimate or preserve soldiers' past, the point of clinical death, designed to return manpower to the front lines even as the Reich bled out. Eyewitness accounts collected after the war add fragments to the picture. A nurse named Marta Ziegler, captured near Pillau in May 1945, testified during NKVD interrogations that wards of the Königsberg hospital were emptied overnight. Patients with severe injuries, amputees, burn victims, those beyond hope of survival, were transferred without notice. She described trucks arriving under SS Guard, their insignia scratched off, loading the wounded into canvas-covered compartments. "They told us it was for evacuation west," she recalled, "but no one came back." Her testimony, preserved in a Moscow archive, was never intended for public release. Soviet units soon discovered sealed bunkers beneath the Königsberg citadel. Inside were rows of examination tables, restraints welded to their sides, and cabinets filled with vials labeled only with initials A12, R3, M9. A medical officer, Colonel Dmitry Karpov, filed a report on 17 April 1945 describing the smell of formalin and burned flesh, adding that some containers emitted unusual radiation levels. His superior, General Belov, ordered the facility sealed, noting in a handwritten addendum, "Research to be transferred discreetly to Moscow under Directorate oversight." The bunker entrances were later bricked up, the city rebuilt atop their remains. Western intelligence caught rumors, but little else. In 1949, a British SIS memorandum, declassified in 2004, mentioned Soviet interest in German experimentation with metabolic prolongation. The note speculated that the USSR was attempting to adapt the findings for use in battlefield medicine during the Korean War. American medical officers stationed in Seoul later reported suspiciously rapid recoveries among captured Chinese and North Korean troops, some displaying anomalous blood chemistry. Officially, these reports were dismissed as battlefield myth. Yet the similarity of phrasing to the Königsberg ledger cannot be ignored. The human cost is glimpsed only in survivor whispers. Displaced civilians from East Prussia spoke of entire hospital wards sealed with red wax seals and SS symbols. Others recalled seeing patients strapped to stretchers with IV lines pumping fluids of dark tar-like color. A Polish forced laborer, whose testimony surfaced in a 1961 court proceeding in Warsaw, recounted overhearing guards speak of soldiers who could march without breath. Whether exaggeration, rumor, or distorted memory, the persistence of such stories across sources suggests an underlying kernel. The Morgenrot ledger itself, though fragmentary, hints at a bureaucracy behind the horror. Columns list resource allocations, quantities of pharmaceutical suspension, requisitions for cadaver refrigeration units, transfers of test materials between Königsberg, Danzig, and Riga. Margins contain initials, possibly those of supervising physicians, Dr. H, Professor K, Lieutenant Col SS, but no full names. One chilling entry reads, Subject 14B, terminated after 72 HR's reanimation. Recommend disposal via incineration. Facility compromised by Soviet artillery. Proximity. What became of the surviving files remains unresolved. The Soviets were meticulous in collecting enemy research, particularly anything with military potential. Some speculate the ledger formed part of the trove transferred to Biopreparat, the vast Soviet biological research program. Others believe it was buried deeper, classified under unusable, too grotesque even for exploitation. Yet odd traces surface. US Army Counterintelligence Corps files from the early 1950s note attempted recruitment of former Königsberg doctors in displaced persons camps, only to find their records missing. In several cases, individuals believed to have worked at Morgenrot disappeared entirely from refugee rolls. One peculiar anomaly occurred in 1984, when construction crews in Kaliningrad, the Soviet renamed Königsberg, accidentally collapsed, part of an old bunker. Workers reported discovering metal cabinets filled with sealed glass jars, many broken. Several laborers fell ill within days, experiencing organ failure and neurological collapse. The incident was swiftly contained, and Soviet media blamed chemical contamination from the war. Western intelligence intercepted chatter, but was unable to confirm details. The collapsed section was reburied with concrete, the area declared off-limits. To this day, Projekt Morgenrot remains an open wound in archival history. The name rarely appears in mainstream war histories, erased by both East and West for reasons of political convenience or moral repulsion. For the families of the vanished patients, there is no record, no grave, only whispers of their final days in sealed wards. The ledger, partially burned, survives in copies smuggled out of Moscow during the chaotic 1990s, now in private hands, circulated quietly among researchers of wartime medicine. Its faded ink lists numbers without names, procedures without humanity. If Morgenrot represented a desperate Reich experiment to defy death itself, its legacy is one of silence. The tunnels beneath Königsberg, bricked and forgotten, hold their secrets still. Occasionally, in modern Kaliningrad, excavators dig too deep and unearth fragments, surgical instruments, rusted restraints, scraps of paper charred black. Each piece suggests that beneath the rubble of war lies a story the world has never been allowed to hear in full. A story where the line between science and atrocity vanished in the dying days of the Reich, leaving only a ledger and the unanswered question of how far the search for victory drove men into darkness. When the Berlin airlift began in June 1948, its purpose was clear: to keep the city alive under Soviet blockade. Between RAF, USAF, and civilian aircraft, thousands of flights ferried coal, flour, and medicine into the shattered city every day. Yet hidden within this logistical miracle was a lesser-known detail buried in US Air Force traffic logs, an unusual designation marked Priority Black. The phrase appeared without explanation, noted alongside a handful of flights into Tempelhof that were otherwise listed as carrying only general supplies. What was so urgent that it merited its own priority outside fuel or food? Eyewitnesses provided the first clues. Ground crews from the RAF's 46 Group, stationed at Wunstorf and Gartow, later testified that several C-54 Skymasters arrived under armed guard with sealed wooden crates. The crates, they recalled, bore no US Army Air Force's insignia. Instead, stenciled markings showed faded remnants of a different era. stylized runes and abbreviations linked to the dismantled SS research institutes. The loads were immediately whisked away under tarpaulin, bypassing standard customs checks. "They weren't on any manifest," remembered one British sergeant decades later. "We were told to look the other way." Officially, no record of such crates exists. Cargo manifests preserved in the National Archives list only foodstuffs and coal tonnage. Yet an internal memorandum from the 317th Troop Carrier Group, dated 12 September 1948, contains a reference to non-human cargo black classification. The phrase is striking. At the time, US Air Force logistics used color codes for categories of material, but black does not appear in any contemporaneous manuals. The annotation was handwritten in the margin of a typed order, as if meant only for those already briefed. The Soviets, observing every aspect of the airlift, noticed. KGB archives, opened briefly in the early 1990s, reveal reports from agents embedded in East Berlin. One, filed on 17 October 1948, describes the unloading of 6 containers under exceptional security measures at Tempelhof. The report notes the presence of American personnel wearing insignia not previously catalogued. Soviet analysts speculated the crates contained nuclear material, perhaps components of tactical warheads, but the language used, equipment of experimental origin, not field-ready, suggests uncertainty. Moscow ordered continued surveillance, but the trail vanished as suddenly as it appeared. The Americans, for their part, maintained strict silence. A 1952 CIA review of Berlin operations includes a censored annex labeled PB Tempelhof. Though most pages are blacked out, one line remains. Transfer completed, no further storage on German soil authorized. This suggests the crates were temporary, passing through Berlin en route elsewhere. Where they went remains a matter of speculation. Some researchers believe they were shipped to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, a site already associated with captured German aeronautical research. Others point to Camp King near Frankfurt, where clandestine programs involving former Nazi scientists operated under Operation Paperclip. Testimonies add layers of unease. In 1969, a retired American airman told a journalist in private correspondence that during the airlift he had been tasked with standing guard near a hangar sealed with US military police. Inside, he said, he once glimpsed a crate partially opened by handlers. It wasn't weapons or fuel, he recalled. It looked like machinery, but not of any type I recognized. Rounded edges, strange wiring. The men handling it wore gloves, as if it was dangerous to touch. His account, though unverifiable, echoed descriptions of advanced prototypes rumored to have been evacuated from SS research facilities in Prague and Breslau. Freedom of information requests made in the 1980s yielded little. The US Air Force responded that all relevant documentation was destroyed in 1962. The date is suspicious. 1962 was also the year of heightened nuclear tensions during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some have speculated that priority black materials were evaluated for use as deterrent technologies, only to be shelved or dismantled when deemed impractical. Others argue the destruction of records was deliberate, meant to conceal either the grotesque nature of the cargo or its failure. British intelligence had their own doubts. MI6 Berlin desk kept a small file on PB anomalies. One surviving note from November 1948 states, RAF personnel instructed to disengage from all American unloading activities marked black. Concerns raised over contamination, risk, chemical, biological, not excluded. The file ends abruptly with a penciled directive. Close matter, beyond remit. To this day, no British government statement has clarified what those concerns entailed. Civilian witnesses add, the most disturbing colour. A Tempelhof mechanic, interviewed in 1977 for an oral history project, claimed that after one unloading, he noticed the tarmac where the crates had sat was scorched as though by acid. Another recalled a faint metallic odour that lingered in the hangar for days. These accounts dismissed as unreliable by official historians, nonetheless mirror the unease present in every fragment of documentation. Something arrived in Berlin in 1948 that did not belong among sacks of flour and bags of coal. The absence of explanation has allowed speculation to flourish. Some believe the crates contained remnants of the fabled V7 flying disc prototypes, captured in the chaos of 1945 and held in secret until a convenient moment. Others argue they were biological weapons research samples, transferred discreetly to prevent discovery by the Soviets. A few point to nuclear material diverted from the Reich's abandoned atomic program. None of these theories can be proven, and all rely on the same frustratingly incomplete archive. What remains undeniable is the paper trail, thin but persistent. References to Priority Black exist in American, British, and Soviet records. The crates were real, they passed through Tempelhof, and their contents were hidden under a classification still unexplained. Whether they were destroyed, buried, or re-engineered in secret labs, the world may never know. For the thousands who lived through the airlift, the crates were a footnote lost amid the larger drama of survival. For historians, they remain a dark aperture into a hidden dimension of post-war power struggles. Today, the airlift is remembered as a triumph of humanitarian logistics, a victory of supply over siege. Yet somewhere within its history lies the shadow of Priority Black, a reminder that even acts of mercy can cloak the burial of secrets too volatile to be spoken. The Berlin sky may have been filled with flour and coal, but on a few unrecorded flights, something else descended onto Tempelhof's runways, cargo erased from official memory, sealed in silence, its traces scorched into the tarmac of history. In the final months of the Pacific War, scattered Japanese units withdrew deep into the jungles of Burma, abandoning airstrips, field hospitals, and supply caches. Among them was Unit 8604, a medical detachment subordinated to the infamous Unit 731, but stationed far from Manchuria. Unlike its northern counterpart, 8604's existence was scarcely recorded, its designation appearing only in scattered dispatches seized by British forces in Rangoon. Yet rumours persisted. Before surrender, its officers buried sealed steel drums containing special stores in the dense teak forests near Tungu. The drums, the rumours claimed, were never recovered. By 1948, British colonial patrols in the region began hearing unsettling reports from villagers. Entire hamlets fell ill, their inhabitants afflicted with burns on the skin, organ failure, and hair loss, symptoms resembling radiation sickness, though no bombs had fallen there. An internal War Office memorandum, dated 14 November 1948, and classified most secret, was titled Sundial. It concluded that Japanese forces almost certainly concealed dangerous materials in the Tungu-Pianmana sector, though the exact nature, biological, chemical, or radiological, remained unknown. The memorandum urged immediate recovery before independence transferred Burma to local control. No record shows that such a recovery was ever conducted. Field reconnaissance did take place. Surviving reports from the 17th Indian Division mention patrols sent into the jungle to locate abandoned caches. In one account, Lieutenant R. McAllister described stumbling across rusting barrels half buried in mud, their surfaces blistered and leaking. He noted a stench like rotting meat and metal and ordered the site marked for follow-up. Days later, heavy rains collapsed the clearing, burying the markers under earth and vegetation. McAllister's superior later annotated the report, "Do not pursue further. Higher authority directs cessation." His patrol diary, preserved in the Imperial War Museum, ends with the line, "Local guides begged us not to return. They said the ground itself was cursed." The Americans showed keen interest. OSS veterans transitioning into the CIA pressed their British counterparts for access to the Sundial files. A cable dated 3 February 1949 from the US Embassy in Rangoon to Washington states. Recommend immediate joint recovery mission. Japanese agents in Bangkok may already be negotiating disposal with hostile powers. Yet by January 1949, Burma had achieved independence, and its new government was unwilling to allow foreign soldiers to roam its interior. Diplomatic efforts stalled, and the Sundial Directive was quietly shelved. Officially, nothing was ever found. The story might have ended there, if not for a peculiar chain of incidents in the 1960s. Burmese forestry workers near Pinmanah reported clearing land for a new road when several laborers collapsed with bleeding, gums, and violent vomiting. Foreign doctors were flown in discreetly under the pretext of a malaria outbreak, but internal Burmese government bulletins acknowledged chemical exposure inconsistent with local conditions. British intelligence intercepted these reports, filing them under residual Sundial concerns. The trail once again went cold. Satellite imagery in the 1970s briefly reignited interest. Analysts examining US reconnaissance photographs of central Burma noticed irregular sinkholes and discoloration of vegetation along the Sitang River basin. A Defense Intelligence Agency assessment, declassified only in part, described possible subsurface containment failures at previously mapped coordinates. Yet the document concluded there was no way to investigate without violating Burmese sovereignty. The recommendation was to maintain watchful silence. The sinkholes were later dismissed publicly as natural karst formations. Local oral histories tell a different story. Elders from Tungu recall Japanese soldiers arriving in early 1945 with convoys of trucks guarded heavily and operating at night. Villagers were ordered indoors under threat of execution. Within days, strange mounds appeared in the jungle, hastily covered with earth. One villager interviewed in 1972 recalled that his father saw soldiers pouring a thick liquid from drums into pits before sealing them with lime. After the war, areas around those mounds became barren, and hunters who ventured near returned sick or did not return at all. The Sundial Memorandum itself, only partially released, contains references to experimental anti-personnel agents of Japanese origin. Historians debate whether this referred to biological pathogens, chemical warfare stocks, or early radiological materials supplied through clandestine channels from Germany. Unit 731 had already experimented with plague, anthrax, and cholera. That Unit 8604 may have experimented with radiological substances, however, remains speculative. Still, the symptoms recorded in Burmese villages, hair loss, burns without fire, wasting illness, align too closely with radiation exposure to be ignored. In the late 1990s, international NGOs reported unusual cancer clusters in villages outside Tungu. Western journalists attempted to link them to wartime contamination, but Burmese authorities denied access, citing sovereignty and cultural sensitivity. A leaked United Nations internal assessment, prepared in 2001, mentioned possible residual contamination from WWII-era burial sites, source unconfirmed. The report was never published. To this day, no official recovery mission has been acknowledged. The Sundial Memorandum lies buried in British archives, its pages heavily redacted, its recommendations unfulfilled. For the families of those who sickened and died in central Burma, there is no explanation. For researchers, the drums of Unit 8604 remain a phantom, sometimes glimpsed in patrol diaries, sometimes inferred from sickness, sometimes half visible in satellite photographs, but never conclusively revealed. If the drums still lie in the jungles of Burma, corroding under decades of monsoon rains, their contents seep silently into the soil. Whether biological agents long since neutralized, chemical weapons leaching into rivers, or radiological matter poisoning villages, their legacy is one of silence enforced by governments on all sides. The war ended in 1945, but in the shadows of Tungu, it may never have truly ended at all. Long after the guns went silent, echoes remained in sealed vaults, blacked out ledgers, and scorched landscapes where truth was erased by design. What the world chose not to remember became the most dangerous knowledge of all. These fragments, half seen, half silenced, are proof that the war never truly ended. It simply moved underground into the archives, into the whispers of those who knew too much. Some doors close forever, others wait for someone reckless enough to force them open.